secret societies and esoteric organizations of the world have passed through three distinct stages with the lapse of ages. Nearly all of the great mystical schools of antiquity were essentially philosophical. That is, they approached life with the search for a better and deeper understanding of the operations of universal law. These old schools, being the repositories of the first sciences of mankind, were dominated by certain concepts of exactitude. They were religious, but their religions were very deeply philosophical and rather amazingly scientific. In their philosophy, they sought to understand in order that they could apply that which they understood to the immediate conduct of their lives. And in times when these mysteries dominated the world systems of policy, they were also devised for the purpose of contributing to the collective security of society. In those days, most of these philosophic systems were actually applied to the regulation of states and nations. And such record as we have would indicate that where this occurred, there was a marked improvement in the life of the people. Gradually, however, these ancient institutions moved from a philosophic foundation to a theological foundation. Philosophy remained. Science, to a measure, also remained. But emphasis was primarily upon the devotional aspects of religion. Out of this great cycle came most of the mystical movements which have survived to the present time. The philosopher finally came to the realization that intellectualism, no matter how idealistic it might be, led ultimately to a kind of mental stalemate. The mind, having exhausted its own potentials, was still faced with the mystery of an unsolved universe. As one scholar has pointed out, when we seek to solve the mystery of the universe, we must remember that man himself is part of this mystery and part of this universe, and that we cannot hope to solve the world mystery without solving the man mystery. This is the most difficult task which the human being ever attempted. Religion, in a way, appeared to circumvent some of these difficulties, for it held an attitude of direct devotion, the possibility of the individual experiencing in his own heart the realities of things which could not be estimated by the mind, so that beyond reason there were certain basic acceptances, and on these acceptances the good life had to be built. As Plato has told us, all learning, therefore, led finally to an enlightened believing. And the individual, having carried his quest as far as he could, and standing in the midst of a universe which he knew to be a rational entity, could then be satisfied without exploring the most remote aspects of this rational entity. He could accept He could assume, therefore, that at the root of life was goodness, wisdom, truth, light, strength, and love. By such believing, he found his way into a more sensitive and at the same time a more simple and direct communion with the mysteries around him and within him. Thus we had the coming of many largely mystical organizations, of which such as the Sufis, the Dervishes, and a number of the mystical sects of China and Japan are examples. The third stage in the development of secret societies and esoteric groups was largely political. In the course of time, there was a gradual corruption so obvious in the management of states that it became increasingly imperative that some organization of well-minded and well-intentioned persons should arise to combat the corruption which threatened the survival of human society. Secret organizations, by their very natures, provided opportunities for the gathering of minds, for the weighing of social and political problems, for the expression of discontents, and even, we may say, the breeding of revolutions. This phase of the secret society more or less died out when it seemed that mankind was well on the way to an ordered international relationship. But as our international relationships have gradually deteriorated, and as the problems of administration have again been heavily burdened with corruption, the tendency of secret organizations has been to revive, as in the case of the Hung Association in China, to again liberate man from the despotism of conditions over which the average disorganized person has little, if any, influence. Thus we can trace the descent of attitudes and the various uses that can be made of private assembly, and how these uses can affect the human being in a number of different ways. With these thoughts in mind, we must now go back to the first age which we have considered, the time in which these secret organizations were essentially philosophical. We have already considered a number of these organizations as those of Egypt and Greece and among the primitive inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. Now we have to turn our attention to the great expanse of Trans-Asia, fully aware that while we have become overly attentive to the development of European and Mediterranean cultures, we have been less thoughtful of that larger part of the world which is Asia, and which from the most remote time has also made a powerful contribution to the general progress of humankind. We are not certain at this date as to when and where those great institutions which were to become the glory of Asia first came into existence. But we are inclined to assume that their genesis was similar to that in other regions, that these mysteries began as with primitive people in the fertility rites, in the various seasonal festivals, and again in that most important of all ceremonies, the ceremony of initiation into citizenship in the tribe. We know that India, long before the rise of the great Aryan migrations, was populated with a people whom we now call the Dravidians. We know not too much of the beginnings of these people, nor are we able to estimate too perfectly their cultural level, but we are inclined to assume that it was barbaric, or at least that it belonged in an aboriginal group, perhaps not so dissimilar from the various tribal religious structures in the world today. At last, from the northern parts of the great band of the Himavat, which we call the mountains, the Himalayas, there descended a series of migrations across what is called the great Gangetic Plain of India. Migrations from the north, which by degrees overwhelmed the original inhabitants and established on this continent the great social institution of the Aryas. The word Arya means the noble, or, as some affirm, the anointed, the set apart, that which has some strange or mysterious destiny in itself. But I think that this would be considered purely a local meaning, not too different from the name Eskimo, for example, which also means a chosen people. We have never been over-influenced by the Eskimos' bid for world domination, nor will we probably be wrong in assuming that nearly every nation regarded itself as the peculiar child of an inevitable destiny, and upon this built the strong processes of its bid for world power. In any event, among these ancient Aryan forebears of the modern Hindus, there were set up certain great rules and regulations of conduct. These enriched and became more complicated and involved in the course of time, and the principal rules and laws which influenced this early people are preserved for us in the Rig Veda and the Institutes of Manu. From these books we learn that the life of the ancient Aryan Hindu was very largely a ceremonial life. The primitive divisions of the caste system appointed certain distinct and inevitable labors. Each group had its tasks appointed. And most of all, it was important to these people that their blood should not be diluted by alliance with the Dravidian forebears. Therefore, rules governing intermarriage and marriage outside of the clan are strongly noted in the ancient Vedic writings. In time, however, as the cultivation of arts and sciences, philosophies, and religious conviction enriched our ancient Aryan forebears, they gradually developed in this mysterious and remote land one of the highest and most abstract cultures the world has ever known. Discussing this problem many years ago with a prominent Hindu, he pointed out that 5,000 years ago, the literacy rate in India was higher than it is in America today. In the interval, however, there has been the inevitable decline of peoples, which is for a large part the account of history. We know that in the ancient Indic lands, scientists, philosophers, scholars, poets, musicians, and artists came to great skill that architecture was cultivated with rare understanding and insight, that many secrets of nature still unknown to us were explored and researched. And out of this entire pageantry of gradually intensifying endeavor, there rose finally the great Brahmanical colleges, which for a long time were the greatest depositories of knowledge of which we have any record. I think we may safely assume that the Brahmanic universities were, like the Egyptian schools, partly devoted to the advancements of science and partly devoted to the unfoldment of the latent potentials within the consciousness of the human being. Asia from the beginning was dominantly introversional. The Asiatic sought to explore not the furthermost parts of space, but the innermost parts of self. This has been the direction of his thinking for thousands of years, and it is only under the immediate impact of present world conditions that we find him extroverting rather frenziedly and without adequate rationalization, largely as the result of the impact of our way of life upon the more remote regions of the earth. We may therefore assume, I believe, that the rites of India, the great Brahmanic schools, taught a kind of complete knowledge. That this knowledge, because Hinduism was not only a religion, but a national and a racial religion, and those not of the race were thereby excluded from participation in its advantages, that ancient Hinduism consisted of one general system of culture which involved all the people in varying degrees, and that the life of the Hindu, whether within the temple or within the privacy of his own home, was under one broad pattern of disciplines. From the record of Pythagoras of Samos, who visited India in the 6th century before the beginning of the Christian era, and was initiated into the Brahmanical rites at Elephanta and Ellora. According to his report, these rituals were identical in meaning, identical in essence, with the initiatory rites of Persia, Egypt, and Greece, in which he had already been duly initiated. He therefore tells us that all the mystery systems of the world, European and Asiatic and North African, had the same essential doctrine, namely the unity of God, the brotherhood of man, and an exact science for the unfoldment and regeneration of human beings. These were the departments and areas of general coverage. We have particular respect for the opinion of Pythagoras in this matter, for the reason that so far as we know, he is the only non-Hindu who was ever initiated into the secret rituals of the ancient Brahmins. Others have claimed this, and I have examined and considered a number of reports claiming to be expositions or exposés of the religious mysteries of the Hindus. And I am convinced that these reports are the productions of imagination or imposture, and that so far as is generally known, Pythagoras and possibly Apollonius of Tyana are the only ones who have a valid claim to having actually participated in the inner rites of the Hindu sanctuaries. In any event, we know very little about these rites. But as we may judge to a measure the root of a tree by the tree itself, its branches, and its fruit, so we may gain some insight as to the original teachings of the Hindus by consideration of the results of these teachings as they spread out across India and later into other parts of Asia, and how through their reforms and reorganizations they became the principal vitalizing agents behind a variety of cultural achievements. Also from the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Puranas, the Bharatas, and other commentaries, we can come to a reasonable understanding of the inner life of these people, of that which was valuable and meaningful to them, of the ceremonies which were essentially required of them, their way of life, and the effect of their religion upon their immediate personal conduct. From all of these sources and by all of these observations, I think we must finally come to the conclusion that Brahmanism was a valid system of instruction, that it was taught by degrees only, that the neophytes or candidates were advanced according to their merits, and were finally entrusted with the most important knowledge possessed by that time and by that people, and that this knowledge definitely had as its heart and soul a secret science of human regeneration, that it was a science dealing with the inner life of man, the relationship between man and nature, and also the relationship between man and God, that the so-called scientific part of this training was dependent upon its religious part, and that what we call its religious part today was both scientific and philosophic, and that these people advanced such sciences as geometry, mathematics, astronomy, and music to a very advanced degree. This does not enable us to revive the details of the ancient form of Brahmanic worship. And I would seriously doubt if this could be revived even by the average Hindu of today. These belong to times far back. And since those times, there have been changes and revolutions of ideas in Asia as in other parts of the world. By degrees, the Brahmanic mysteries fell into the Brahmanic theology. And in turn, this has ultimately led to a certain Brahmanic sociology, even a Brahmanic political science. But for our purposes, I believe that we must accept that at a very ancient time, the rites of the Hindus, paralleling those of other enlightened nations, were dedicated to the most noble and constructive of purposes, and sought to create in society a valuable and integrated human being. Now we know that this declined. We know that it declined in Greece, and that the great Dionysian rituals of the Greeks are finally remembered to us only by the bacchanalian orgies of Rome. We know that in many respects, religions and philosophies have lost their essential value and have by degrees fallen into ill repute. At the same time, out of these ancient Indian schools came a series of reforms, and these reforms were in truth merely specializations, efforts on the part of enlightened and conscientious persons to restore the integrity and ethics of great systems that had come into decline. We like to sometimes consider Christianity to be largely a reformed Judaism, in which, as the Master himself says, He came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. And I think in India also, the great schools, such as the Vedanta, or the Yoga, the Tantra, and perhaps a little later, the Jain, and even we might include the Sikhs, that these different groups were essentially revealed, or their messages were revealed by persons who had received Hindu initiation, and that therefore these schools were indebted to the primary stream of Aryan culture for the essential principles of their doctrine. Some have gone so far, and perhaps with good reason, to infer or imply that Hinduism, or ancient Aryanism, as it was primordially taught, traces, or can be traced in most of the religious systems of the now existing world. That the stream of the ancient wisdom of India flowed into Europe, flowed into North Africa, and by some mysterious route, perhaps across Asia, finally even reached the Western Hemisphere long before the advent of European colonization. But regardless of how we wish to regard these stories, the fact remains that the ancient Hindus did have secret sciences, did impose certain disciplines, did initiate their disciples into various sacred formulas, did practice natural and ceremonial magic, were concerned with the intonation of the sacred names, were conversant with the principles of sidereal motion and the essential structure of the universe, had calculated the duration of the days and nights of Brahma, and had also, rather closely to our own calculations, estimated the true motions of most of the parts of the heavens. Thus, somewhere long ago, some very solid work was done. And we are all the richer for this work, although we are not too well equipped to describe the detailed circumstances. About the 6th century before the beginning of the Christian era, or very close to the time of the journey of Pythagoras to the caves of Elephanta in the harbor of Bombay, and to the Ajanta temples in the Hyderabad Deccan, a great change was being wrought in the religions and philosophies of Asia. Several great and extraordinary persons appeared, whose influence upon the cultural destiny of mankind was to be prodigious. Perhaps the most famous and most universally understood of these men was Gautama Buddha, himself a Hindu, of the caste of the warriors, and bound as an initiate into the sacred religious rites of his ancestors. In Persia arose the last of the Zoroasters, Zarathustra Spitama, and from him came clear doctrinal indication of a strong link between the religions of Persia and the religions of India. Also at this time, there flourished in China one of the most mysterious human beings who has ever lived, and that was Lao Tzu. This mystic, this transcendental sage, this self-disciplined, self-educated, self-enlightened man was to become the greatest mystic of Asia. And even today, his solitary writing, the Tao Te Ching, in only 5,000 characters, is the most inscrutable book in the world. Yet it is interesting to note that this book has suddenly become of the greatest interest and concern to us. Whereas we have gone further in the experimentation concerning the mental life of man, we begin to recognize some of the principles that were enunciated by Lao Tzu. In this same generation also, the most formal and perhaps one of the most respected men who ever lived, the philosopher Confucius, enriched China with a magnificent ethical doctrine. Confucius made no claim to any particular mystical insight. He claimed, however, that he had a mission, a destiny. And that destiny was to bring to China a way of life suitable to a civilized human being and suitable to ensure the gradual spread of enlightenment and peace, first in China and then perhaps throughout the entire world. These men, contemporaries, left so vast an impress upon the face of Asia that they largely overshadowed the older traditions which were gradually falling into decline. Yet we cannot say that these men were spontaneous productions. They themselves originated in the tradition which preceded them. They were almost certainly in their own right initiates of the sacerdotal mysteries of their nations. They were learned in the wisdom of their people, in the wisdom of old time, and in the learning of the gods. And from their various contributions, many changes came to take place in the face of Asia. Many new doctrines and ideals were promulgated. But all in all, these were merely the long extension of the Vedic law. They were the shadow of the great original instruction and teaching imparted by Manu to his people in the mysterious northern regions of the Himavat. The mysteries, as they arose in Buddhism, are somewhat more easily understood and traceable. Gautama Buddha was essentially a reformer, but he was more than this. He was a clarifier. He took from the older doctrine those essential principles which he regarded as most necessary to the enlightenment of man. He contemplated upon the sources and causes of the decline of the Brahmanic rites. He realized that by degrees opportunism had corrupted the priesthood of the Hindu mysteries, and that in order to defend their own rights and privileges, this priesthood had become more and more arrogant and more despotic, until for the average member of the East Indian community, there was little, if any, hope for spiritual enlightenment or even consolation of spirit. Gradually, form and ritual took over. The soul and spirit vanished, and only the letter of the law remained. And it was against this letter of the law that Gautama Buddha rebelled. The philosophy of Buddhism is therefore not to be regarded as essentially different from that of the older teachings. We know also that in his earnest desire to be of benefit to mankind, Buddha taught more publicly and perhaps more clearly than most of those who had preceded him. On the other hand, either because of his own ethical convictions or in respect for the obligations which he had previously assumed, Buddha, throughout his entire ministry, carefully avoided infringing any of the secrets or any of the esoteric doctrines essentially associated with Hinduism. In other words, he refused to take into consideration or to expound or to interpret or to elucidate those phases of Hinduism which were normally communicated under obligation. Perhaps he also felt, and this has been the general viewpoint held regarding him, that these Hindu or Brahmanic rites were either not essential to the peculiar ministry which he attempted to spread. Or perhaps realizing that he was preaching in India to Hindus, that they were already well informed on these matters. There are indications in the New Testament where it would seem that Jesus followed the same procedure, not necessarily touching upon the teachings of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who were not, by the way, quite as black as they have been painted, but regarded these other teachings as the common possession of the people. Therefore, it was not necessary to comment upon them or to make public utterance concerning their meanings. In any event, Buddha obviously refused to discuss the creation of the world, the origin of the gods, or any of those peculiar yogic and Vedantic practices with which the Hindu system was so richly encrusted. Rather, to Buddha, the entire body of philosophy and wisdom was summarized in a simple formula to assist the average person to escape from the quandaries of life and to establish a career based upon intelligence, dedication, discipline, and truth. Thus, we can definitely assume that it is not proven that Buddha was, as some have affirmed, an atheist. Had he been an atheist, he could not have been an initiated Hindu. It is not at all certain that he was even an agnostic, for had he been an agnostic, the Brahmanic temples would not have accepted him, and we know that they did. Therefore, we are justified in assuming that he simply closed off the mystery pattern, except that he used it in a way which was in no way an infringement, but based upon it a system of life which he communicated in a totally different manner. The story of Buddhism, then, has to do with a modified aspect of Hinduism, in which instead of initiating disciples in ancient stone temples far beneath the earth or in the sides of hills, the Buddhists initiated their disciples in a different way, perhaps to imply that all initiation is an internal experience. Therefore, the place where it is given is not as important as the fact that it is experienced inwardly by the devotee. There are, however, references in Buddhist literature to the fact that at one time in the early development of the sect there were initiation rituals, even as there is a strong reference in several writings to the fact that initiation rituals were present in the early centuries of Christianity, although these have generally come to be ignored or forgotten. It is also very possible that what we call today the Apocalypse, or the Book of Revelation, was associated with the initiation rites, ceremonies, and dramatic presentations of the early Christians. We have reference, for example, to the fact that in a cavern of 7 rooms called the Septapana Cave, Buddhist disciples were initiated into the mysteries of their order. Some have affirmed that this room of 7 chambers was the human heart, where initiation must naturally take place. Hermes says as much to his son Tatian in regard to the great pyramid of Egypt, where he said that the pyramid stands modeled upon a human heart, because it is in the human heart that all the mysteries of godliness must be experienced. There are also further indications that with the rising of the Sangha, or the assembly, the church or association of Buddhism, that certain simple rites were given, certain ordinations, baptisms, confirmations were bestowed, and that as in the case of nearly all mystical or philosophical rituals or religions, there were public instructions and also other instructions given only to the disciples. And later, these secret instructions passed from Buddha to his legitimate arhats, or the great disciples of his order. And by these, in turn, other disciples were initiated into the mysteries of the doctrine. This type of teaching was based almost completely upon the guru system of the Hindus. And the arhats of Buddha are the gurus of his faith. They are also the holy men, the wise ones. And never will we find a closer parallel than that between the rishis of Brahmanism and the rehats and lohans of Buddha. So the general underlying structure remains approximately the same. But in Buddhism we have the rise of a democracy. We have the coming of something that was to change largely the thinking of the people of his time. And his concept of education and the principles upon which his philosophy was built finally integrated into the formation of the great University of Nalanda in central India, where the instruction which had once privately been given in the Brahmin sanctuaries or had been communicated under obligation in the valley of the Euphrates, this instruction was made available in another way. At Nalanda, which is perhaps the largest university the world has ever known, entrance was for those who desired to learn. No longer was initiation or acceptance into this institution dependent upon blood or family or caste or even creed. The great requirement was a devout determination to improve oneself. Therefore, from all over Asia, students seeking knowledge visited the wonderful community college or university, which was famous for centuries for its great lotus pools in which blue lotus flowers blossomed, it is said, throughout the year. The University of Nalanda is mentioned by a few early travelers and writers before its final decline and disappearance. These say that in this university there was a faculty of over 1,500 or 2,000 instructors, that the student body frequently numbered above 25,000 at a single time, and perhaps more, and that the university and its buildings and its student body occupied a complete city, and that here there were towers for the study of the stars, great laboratories for research into nature. Here art and medicine and law were studied, and here, we are told, Christianity was taught as part of comparative religion. The University of Nalanda, therefore, was much like the temple schools of Egypt and Greece. But instead of the candidate becoming initiated by oath and obligation, Buddhism simply opened the door and said, "Brother, do you wish to know? If you do, come and learn with us." This was therefore perhaps Buddha's greatest departure. He felt that it was no longer right that knowledge be held into the narrow bonds of class and caste, that all men were created with the inalienable right to know. But it is further true that most of those who attended this great college finally did take holy orders, becoming themselves monks and mystics. For we also know that in this same university the transcendental arts were taught. And here the Buddhist equivalent to the most secret arts of yoga and Vedanta were communicated. But they were communicated again in a different way, not with the ceremonial magic of ancient Hinduism, but now as forms of discipline, in which the individual imposed certain duties upon himself, in which the individual followed the original instruction given by Buddha in his last great service or sermon, as recorded in the book of the Great Decease, where he turned to his assembled disciples and said to them, "My brethren, be an island unto yourselves. Be a refuge unto yourselves. Work out your own salvation with diligence." This was the summary and substance of Buddhism. That it offered no magic, but that it provided the individual with a wonderful power to be his own magician. And that by certain meditations, disciplines, by the control and directing of habit and character, by continual abstinence from those corruptions which turn the mind from the contemplation of reality to engrossment in illusion, the Buddhists gradually obtained those internal powers which had previously been regarded as the magic of Hinduism. We know also that the struggle between Buddha and the Brahmins ended finally in the defeat of Buddhism in India. Little by little, the Brahmanic caste, the Brahmanic religion, the ancient religion of the land, encroached upon the achievements of Buddhism. Little by little, the Brahmins regained their ancient authority. And in the end, Buddhism retired to other nations and left India to its Hinduism, which in turn finally received a terrible blow with the rise of Muslim power in India. And during this rise, both the Buddhist and Brahmin monuments were mutilated or destroyed, and the temporal power of Hinduism was broken so far as India is concerned. By that time, however, most of Buddhism had departed from the land and had found haven in other and more congenial regions. Among the early arhats of Buddhism, there are many who have been variously attributed with magical powers, and practically every attribute of the ancient Egyptian, Greek initiate is to be recorded of these Buddhist arhats. They had the miraculous powers of invisibility. They could communicate themselves, they could communicate with others at a distance. They could precipitate themselves invisibly through space. And one of them, like our dear old friend Daruma, or Bodhidharma, patriarch of Zen, is said to have sailed across the China Sea on a millet stalk. These were the magics of Buddhism. But this magic is deep in the old concept of esotericism. And in the course of time, this esotericism burst forth again. It was declared that in his sermon on the Vulture's Peak, Buddha had communicated esoterically to one of his disciples the secret of universal meditation. On this occasion, therefore, there was created a secret school. And in this secret school, not only were human beings, but also creatures of the invisible regions, instructed in the mysteries of the doctrine of salvation. After the passing of Buddha, a number of years and even a few centuries elapsed. But gradually, the esoteric side of Buddhism broke through again. And that which had long been an austere philosophy now began to take on its religious complexion. So we find the second stage of Buddhism, as we suggested at the beginning, the gradual drift from a philosophy to an advanced mysticism. This advanced mysticism arose at about the beginning of the Christian era. It is a little difficult to tell just when, but this is a very interesting and vital point, and sometimes a great deal may hinge upon the clarification. Up to now, however, the documents and records are not available. But it is, of course, possible that, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, material relating to this critical time will ultimately be recovered. It was generally assumed that esoteric Buddhism had its great revival in the 1st century A.D., and that in some way or method there was a connection between the Mahayana school of Buddhistic mysticism and the rising school of Christianity in the Near East. That physical contact was possible, there is no doubt, for it has already been demonstrated that the Silk routes were open, that caravans coming from China, India, Siam, then Siam, and Cambodia did reach southern Europe, and that even at the time of the Roman Empire, the Romans were wearing silk woven in China. This means that contact is quite possible, but the certainties we do not have. More recent studies, however, are inclined to push back the date of the rise of the Mahayana sect to probably the 1st century B.C. If such is the case, then we have an entirely different story, but we cannot be dogmatic on this subject now. In any event, Nagarjuna found in the Iron Tower the secret books of Mahayana. It was from this structure, therefore, that a great Buddhist mysticism arose, known as the Northern School, or the School of High Buddhism, a school which reached its greatest ecclesiastical apex in the rising of Lamaism in Tibet and the establishment of the hierarchies of the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. Here was high Buddhism, with its high mass, with all of its rites and rituals, with its saints' days and holy beads, with everything that had to do with an involved ecclesiasticism. And not far from Lhasa itself, perched upon a nearby peak, the great magical medical monastery of Tsongkhapa, where the deepest mysteries of magic and sorcery, where the ancient teachings of the Kala Chakra and the Tantra, where yoga and all of the mysteries relating to breath, meditation, and mantram were taught and continued to be taught until the recent Russian invasion. So we have in this instance one phase of our Mahayana, and the fact that certainly initiation into Lamaism in Tibet was for centuries a most profound and elaborate ritual, divided into several degrees, with candidates advancing step by step from the more profane subjects to those that dealt entirely with sacred matters. In all of these groups, from the Hindu down through Buddhism, among the more advanced studies were those which involved the scriptures of the people. And in many areas, even today, learned Hindus or Buddhists can recite volumes almost as long as the entire Bible from memory. Great study and studentship in these specialized areas. The rise of Mahayana brought with it a kind of Eastern Gnosticism. There was a wonderful multiplication of hierarchy. The invisible worlds began to take precedence over all visible matters. The strange austerity of the Nibbana gave way to Amitabha's blessed land. And there is no doubt in the world that a large part of this ritualism and symbolism was actually ritualistic. In the Field Museum in Chicago, there is a large group of costumes and masks used by Tibetan people and those of surrounding areas such as Mongolia, Bhutan, and Nepal for the presentation of sacred dramas. Here we will see, for example, the entire paradise of Amitabha, provided for by exact costumes and masks to be worn by actors. who therefore undoubtedly presented this spectacle, much as the Egyptians performed their mysterious rituals of the dead in the crypts beneath the temples of Luxor and Karnak. Thus, in the northern schools, certainly in Tibet and several other areas, there is no doubt that the rituals described in the Buddhist sutras were actually performed, that candidates were actually conducted through the mysteries of the eight worlds, that disciples seeking initiation experienced the 12 nidanas, and probably in the end came face to face with the mirror of righteousness, in which they could perceive in the dark and mysterious depths of what obsidian lens all of the mysterious happenings of their own previous lives. It was an involved system of ritualism, but it certainly existed. And there is much material in connection with this subject to be found in the Field Museum in Chicago and in a publication which they have issued, a pamphlet, dealing with the magical and mystery plays of Tibet. In other parts of Asia, Mahayana also took over in a very powerful way. I do think, however, that in most of these other regions, the gentle mystery of Buddhism became more and more entirely personal. And one of the teachings even of Mahayana was that the entire initiation rite should be accepted into the self as a phase of consciousness. It was not by seeing actors performing their rituals, or even by magical means causing invisible spirits to appear to produce various effects upon the beholders. These were not the ways of wisdom in Buddhism. Their way was that the individual in quietude should contemplate upon the mysteries of the law, and following the essential teachings of the Tathagata, should gradually come to know, to experience inwardly, to be released gradually from the pressure of worldly conditions, until finally they could rest in peace, in quiet communion with their own inner lives, to be instructed by the golden Buddha that was enshrined forever in their own hearts. This was their essential teaching. But we cannot say that this teaching was never modified, or never subject to any changes or specializations. We realize also that as Buddhism passed from one nation to another, it mingled itself very much with the local beliefs and traditions of the people, so that Buddhism became a series of admixtures. It was never the practice or habit of Buddhism to attempt the extermination of another religion, nor did it ever persecute the followers of other faiths. Rather, it settled beside them and gradually absorbed them into its own structure, or finally acknowledged that after all, both groups were worshiping the same principles under other names. This tolerance led to a very favorable relationship between Buddhism and most of the nations where its missionaries visited. We know also that among the great initiate adepts, as they were called, who are associated with the University of Nalanda, two names stand out as being of particular interest to us. One, of course, was the Blessed Guru, who brought the doctrines of Buddhism to Tibet, carrying the books across the great mountain passes, or driving oxen laden with sacred material over the mountains into the forbidding land above the snow. And wonderfully enlightened, and with a transcendent capacity to understand the mysteries of the moral universe in which he existed. But after his time, his words, and particularly his little book, The Tao Te King, brought around a number of scholars, and schools were built about these texts, which were so mysterious, so enigmatical, that almost any possible interpretation could be given to them. Thus tremendous bodies of interpretive and commentary material were built up, and high intellectuals pondered these works year after year, gradually assembling themselves into a community of philosophic ascetics who departed from all worldly considerations to devote themselves almost exclusively to the effort to transmute their own lower nature. Gradually also, as in Buddhism, the Taoistic point of view moved from the philosophic to the religious, and out of this motion there arose the medievalism of Taoism, which corresponds to our age of magic, the Kabbalah, alchemy, hermetic arts, and everything of this nature. We then also meet a strange assembly of Taoist arhats, or adepts, mystics initiated into the secrets of life, possessing powers beyond ordinary mortals, living for centuries, flying about the sky on the backs of cranes. All of these strange and wonderful beings, either creatures of fantasy and imagination, or perhaps more severely and certainly, they refer to certain initiated teachers who had acquired through Taoism the same secret knowledge of magical arts that had once streamed from India. There is no doubt that Lao Tzu was in a position, as librarian of the Chu, to be in comparatively close contact with the migration of sacred writings from India, for many such works were conserved in the great libraries of the Chu dynasty. Thus, Lao Tzu actually stood as a kind of bridge between the wisdom of China and the esoteric knowledge of India. There seems to be much to imply that either Lao Tzu himself or those who came after him drank of this fountain of Indian wisdom and lore, and that out of the original Taoism there developed a form of magic, a transcendentalism, a form of Tantra, around which an enormous literature was built and about which innumerable miracles are recorded, became a very fascinating subject. Also that there was a mysterious place called the Jade Mountains, perhaps hidden away in the most remote parts of the Diamond Mountains of Korea. And here the adepts and initiates of Taoism dwelt together in an eternal garden. And from this strange, mysterious center, they sent teachers into the world and contributed their part to the invisible government of mankind. This all becomes extremely legendary and extremely complicated. But out of all the legendary and lore, we gain some landmarks. And among these landmarks are indications that Taoism also was at one time presented as a dramatic spectacle, that dramas, theatrical productions, and other performances were given, that these various deities and genii were embodied or impersonated by priests, and that there was a secret and mysterious ritual which unfolded some of the esoteric elements of the subject. Now, with Confucianism, we do not have too much of this element. Confucianism was very largely a formal intellectualism. It was a deep and penetrating system. It was morally magnificent, ethically sublime. But Confucius himself left to Lao Tzu all the mysteries of the faith. He lived a very solemn and informed teacher with tremendous insight, tremendous integrity. But as far as we can learn, he was not involved in the establishment of secret or magical schools. He was undoubtedly himself, however, a member of the essential religious system of his time, the ancient religion of China. And it is quite possible that from birth on through life, this religion bestowed certain formulas, certain symbols, certain obligations upon the Chinese gentleman or the Chinese scholar, and that the principles of the basic faith of his nation, as communicated by Fu He, the eternal emperor, was communicated with
the education of the classics in the great university system of China. Now, as we study these different elements and factors, we come upon one or two other interesting points, which I think are worth considering. Gradually, beginning about the 7th century, perhaps a little earlier, Buddhism, which had reached Korea, began to drift over into Japan as a result of the wonderful insight, piety, and skill of Shotoku Taishi, the Prince Regent of Japan. This far-sighted man helped to build the first monasteries and to bring the faith to the Japanese people. And in the rise of Japanese Buddhism, we come upon a variety of extensions of various esoteric systems. Practically all of the Japanese schools of Buddhism, directly or indirectly, originated in China or Korea, and more remotely in India. And in the very beautiful old city of Nara, where the Horyuji Temple is, there are murals on the walls, which unfortunately were badly damaged by fire in 1949, but have been restored. Murals of Buddhist ritual, Buddhist symbolism, that are almost identical with the paintings on the Ajanta caves of central India. Thus, we have every reason to believe that Indian influence reached to the mysterious islands of the dragonfly, as ancient Japan was called. In Japan, there were many sects, and each of these sects of Buddhism developed certain peculiar symbolisms of its own. Perhaps the most interesting from a symbolic and ritualistic standpoint of the Japanese sects is the Shingon-shu, or the Shingon sect. This was founded by a most enlightened monk, mystic, Kobo Daishi. The story of Kobo Daishi is that when he was a very small child, he would kneel on the floor in prayer, and Buddha would come to him and teach him. There is a very beautiful painting of the child Kobo Daishi seated upon the blossom of a lotus with his hands clasped in prayer, adoring the invisible presence of Buddha. This child grew up to become one of the great religious leaders of his time. But like several other famous persons in different parts of the world, Kobo Daishi was a universal genius. He was an architect, an artist, a musician. He helped to build cities and build temples and drain swamps. He was a master of literature and of letters and of art. He was accredited with the power of magic and of healing. And he is even said to have contributed very much to the improvement and simplification of the Japanese language. He was just one of these universal geniuses. But the most important contribution that he made was to bring over from Central Asia the great system of mandala worship, or the worship of secret magical designs and figures. The Shingon-shu, therefore, is represented in Japanese art by some of the most extraordinary designs that are known in the religious world today. These designs are all symbolic representations of the universe, and may be divided essentially into two groups: those designs which have to do with the invisible causal or divine universe, and that group which has to do with the visible universe of effects in all of its attributes. To simplify and yet clarify the mysterious relationships between the visible and the invisible, Kobo Daishi used a language of Buddhistic figures, substituting in some cases letters of the Sanskrit alphabet for the actual deities, and arranging these deities in the most interesting, amazing mathematical formulas to inspire meditation and the advancement of man's spiritual destiny. The designs and symbols used in the production of these mandalas has not changed since they were originally devised, and all religious artists have copied them from generation to generation. They are meditation pictures, and again are startlingly reminiscent in many aspects with the teachings of the systems of Raja and Dana Yoga. Kobodaishi, it is said, never died, but went to sleep in his tomb because he was bored to distraction by the vanities of the world. Regardless of that, it is believed that sometime he will come forth at the right day and restore the ancient structure of esoteric Buddhism. Who knows? Another interesting personality in the rise of Japanese Buddhism was Shonin Nichiren. Nichiren was an entirely different type of man, a rather gruff, unpleasant person, and more or less of a fanatic. But he arose at a moment when Japan was threatened by invasion by Genghis Khan and his Mongols, and it was therefore a most timely and expedient thing that the people should be brought together in some strong and simple faith. The doctrine of Nichiren is based upon one very simple thing, namely, that in any emergency, in any crisis of life, at any time of great need or prayer, a need of great sustenance or courage, the mind should simply seat itself firmly upon the realization of the scripture of the lotus, and that by merely quietly holding the words of Buddha in the mind, all doubt and uncertainty would vanish away. It was a very simple belief, and it did gain a large following and still has a large following. Now in Japan, in addition to the rise of various Buddhistic sects, of which possibly the most austere but the most interesting to us today is Zen, there was a nature worship, an essential religion belonging to the people, a religion founded also in strange, mystic, and psychic rituals and rites. This religion was Shinto, and Shinto was a worship of kamis, or spirits, or beings. Most perhaps familiar to us is that part of Shinto which deals with the worship of the emperor, or deified heroes. In any event, however, Shinto has given Japan one of its great and important gifts, and that has been its love of nature, its tremendous adoration for the consciousness everywhere present in natural things. In Nara also, the city we previously mentioned, is the great Kasura Palace, one of the most beautiful examples of architecture in the world, and this was essentially a Shinto monument. It has been visited by millions of people all over the world who have found in its gardens and buildings an exquisite design that in itself inspires the loftiest and most sublime religious feelings. And this is regardless of the religion to which you may belong. It is simply the religion of beauty, the religion of graciousness and simplicity, as part of the great essential doctrine of Shinto. The Shinto faith has its own sacred books, which are combinations of cosmological and historical accounts. The principal ones of these are called the Kojiki and the Nihonji. These books deal with the prehistoric foundation of Japan, the myths and legends relating to the gods, the establishment of the royal dynasty, and its descent from Amaterasu Omikami, goddess of the sun, and all of the various legends and incidents which make up the first several centuries of Japanese history. These books are held to be sacred, because in Shinto, history is sacred. And Shinto justifies this on the simple ground that history is sacred because history teaches. History teaches us as Scripture teaches us. So there can be no Scripture more valid than history, which shows clearly and beyond doubt how all action results in natural and appropriate reaction, how evil destroys itself, how corruption overflows and destroys its own power, how dictators rise and fall, and most of all in history we find the inevitable emergence of the ordinary person as the one most loved and honored by the gods. The esotericism of Shinto consists of meetings and assemblies held not only for dramatic purposes, for the preservation and perpetuation of the Noh theater and the other high forms of Nara and Kamakura artistry. But in Shintoism, we have a strong survival of spiritism. In Shintoism, we have Oriental spiritualism. We have mediumship, the tilting of tables, the materializing of objects, teleportation from one place to another. We have the development of secret arts and sciences concerning the control of the body. And out of the combination of Shinto and Buddhism, we have such doctrines as those of Judo, in which in the lower grades we have discipline and body control, and in the higher grades a deep and profound esoteric knowledge of the nerve centers of the human body and how these can be manipulated to destroy life or to restore it after the individual is dead. All these points have a little something to do with Shinto. Shinto, represented to our mind largely by the red torii gate or the beautiful inverted fan-shaped cone of Fujiyama, is in reality a ritual of kinship with life. It is the ritual of the cherry tree viewing. It is the ritual of the night of the full moon, when the whole community goes out simply to gaze upon beauty. It is the ritual of the 17-syllable poem. It is the ritual of the unpainted walls, the mysterious festivals of the dead, when it is believed that the country of these people is so beautiful that once a year even the dead wish to leave paradise and return to the gardens of the Katsura. This type of thinking is Shinto, and we cannot say that it is not a valid religion. We cannot say that while it worships nature in numerous personified and non-personified attributes, that it has not discovered the spirituality of the bird, the spirituality of the laws governing the life and death of the butterfly, a spirituality which comes forth in the most simple reverence for the common things of life, and yet at the same time, influenced by Zen, becomes a complete self-discipline in which the individual becomes almost impregnable simply because he has lost all trace of fear. These various phases of our subject, I think, are worth some consideration. Now, across the entire surface of the areas which we have been considering, China, even India to a lesser degree, because by this time India was pretty well out of the old religious picture, but wherever Buddhism certainly extended its sphere of influence, secret societies began to develop their third aspect, and that was political. And in the rise of the political societies in Asia, we do not have a clean and complete break away from the older doctrines. We have the rise of a new type of interpretation. Perhaps no phase of this is more interesting than the Hung Society of China, or the Heaven and Earth Federation. Here we find flowing into a definite secret society with rights, degrees, passwords, grips, symbols, with the ornamentations, jewels, and adornments of the lodge, with all the means of recognition, all of the rites of preparation and purification, all of the most severe and strict obligations of conduct and character, and a lodge room properly decorated and symbolically populated with officers and various personalities representing both physical and spiritual realities. Here in the Assembly of Heaven and Earth, or the Hung Association, we have a secret society in Asia which is based upon a mingling of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and Jos, which is the Chinese equivalent of Shinto. All of which makes a rather complicated picture, but then these secret societies were always a little complicated, and that is one of the reasons why the initiates never tired of trying to explore the subject a little further. In the Heaven and Earth Association, or the Home Society, we had also the culmination of 500 years of Chinese political unrest. We had one dynasty of corrupt rulers after another. We had gradual decline of the right to the people. We had, therefore, a situation in which Buddhist leaders, Confucianists, and Taoists especially, forgot whatever differences there may have been among them and united for the simple purpose of preserving China. Now, they had an idea behind this, which is a little different, perhaps, from our viewpoint, because when we unite to preserve something, we immediately start waving a banner, and first thing you know, we have a John Birch Society or something in our midst. The Chinese did it differently. The Chinese took the attitude that the beginning of the liberation of China was the education of the individual in those values which were essential to his own proper living and to the preservation of society. So the Heaven and Earth Association sought to educate the ignorant millions of China. It had to be a secret society, or it would have been exterminated by those who wanted no one but themselves to be educated. And China had not forgotten that one of their emperors, who was unable to attain much scholarship himself, condemned all of the learned intellectuals, the artists, the musicians, the sculptors, the philosophers, astronomers, and priests of China to go out into the desert and build a wall for him. And thus it was that the Great Wall of China came into being. So the Chinese did not dare to expose their hands. And the question then arose, which has frequently arisen in secret societies, how to educate an individual painlessly, quickly, and adequately. We have never really solved this one ourselves, but it is a good thought. Instead, therefore, of settling down to the present system of curriculum, which may or may not be effective in about 18 years, the Chinese had to work out a system whereby certain essential ideas could be quickly and adequately communicated. And they did this through ritualism. They did it by presenting the candidate with certain spectacles, attended by solemnity. They caused him to be deeply mindful of what he was experiencing. He regarded himself as peculiarly privileged in that he could be present, and that therefore he had a great obligation. For having attained this knowledge, he must use it, and he must also protect it at all costs from the profane. Thus, in a comparatively short time, a great ethical, moral instruction was transferred. The individual did not necessarily become skilled in arts and sciences, but he did become skilled in the concept of right and wrong, which we have more or less completely lost sight of. He was skilled in dedication, devotion, and honor. He was skilled in fraternity, in willingness to defend and support those things which he held to be right, even at the expense of his own life. He was taught to obey. He learned to discipline his own faculties and powers. And he received a strange inner vision of what the gods wanted of man, which to these people was the greatest of all instruction. To know what the universe wants, to know how to be a faithful custodian of universal knowledge, how to apply principles to those ends which are of the common utility to all. These are the truths which education must essentially communicate. So in the Association of Heaven and Earth, the candidate was told the meaning of the various myths and legends which in popular living he had general acceptance. Almost all the characters of Buddhism, with which we are familiar, the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin, the gracious Lady of Compassion, the Bodhisattva Manjushri, the Lord of Wisdom, the Bodhisattva Seichi, the God of Strength and Truth, and dear old Hopai, the rotund Bodhisattva, who is a symbolic representation of Maitreya, the Buddha to be. All of these appear in the rituals of the Hung Association. parts, masks, and all, they come to communicate something of their doctrine, to bind the candidate to the old and the true, to remind him of the mysterious truth locked in mythology. And I think it is quite possible that the same was true in China, that was true in Greece, and that many of the popular legends now circulated in China were originally part of the ritual of the Hu Association. In any event, this association did struggle on, did make its place politically, did accomplish the first liberation of China, and did establish the democracy of the Chinese people under its own appointed initiate leader, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. The Hung Association was therefore evidence of a long descent, a descent of ideas, and the continuance and preservation of a priceless heritage of conviction, which is tremendously important to the average person, tremendously important to all of us, to have a little of that sentimentality about us that we like to believe, we like to hope that the great truths that we have held sacred are real, are important, and can result in a universal advantage for mankind. In Japan, we also find the rise of political society. Japan had a very rocky historical background, and after the disappearance of the gods and those great princes descended from Jimmu Tenmu, the first emperor of Japan, there were troubles, one trouble after another. These troubles resulted in centuries of civil wars, resulted in misery and pain to thousands of people. And little by little, the dynasties and powers of the people were exploited. The emperor was practically a religious exile, with no temporal authority whatever. And one powerful family after another. At one time, the Fujiwara family, and at another time, the great Minamotos ruled tyrannically as military dictators, forming what was called the curtain government. These leaders paid hollow homage to the emperor, but actually ran the country in their own way. After a while, however, there arose among the Japanese people one rather strong, not particularly desirable, and certainly utterly despotic person, but still a born natural leader, and that was Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi was to a certain degree the Oliver Cromwell of Japan. Others have likened him to Napoleon, but I think the Cromwell parallel is perhaps the most apt. He became, so to say, Lord Protector. He was not officially a shogun or ruler because he came from a comparatively humble family and was not accepted socially. On the other hand, no one could refuse him on any other level than the social standing. On one occasion, he wished to have an interview with the emperor, but because of his low social status, was not permitted to enter the imperial presence. With the kind of foresight that made him one of the most powerful men of his country, he simply leaned over and, seeing the son of the emperor standing nearby, picked up the child in his arms and walked past the guards and into the imperial presence. No one dared to touch him because he was carrying the emperor's son. This was his way of doing things, and he got things done. But his son was not much of a help any more than the son of Oliver Cromwell was a particular success. And another family, the great family of the Tokugawa, came into power. And the Tokugawa, under the leadership of its first great founding member, Ieyasu, became the ruling power in Japan for nearly 250 years. In this time, peace was restored. The condition of the people constantly improved. The merchant took the place of the aristocrat. The samurai went entirely out of fashion and became hopelessly in debt to the ordinary shopkeepers. Gradually, a powerful, protected democracy arose. The Tokugawa shoguns were at one moment strict and the next lax. They made many laws that nobody could keep, and then they insisted on the keeping of a number of laws that they had never made. But at the same time, all in all, things went along rather well until the first impact of Western culture upon the Japanese people. At this time, trouble started to brew when it became obvious that the great hierarchy of the Tokugawa was coming to an end. Then, at this moment, we had another rise of secret societies, this time in Japan. Now, they may have come along earlier because back many, many centuries before, the great Japanese hero, Yusaku Kuni, was said to have been educated in a forest by a group of strange birdmen called Tengu. Under the rulership of a strange and mysterious person, the Dai Tengu, this hero and prince became the most fearless and skilled of warriors. Now, no one has ever been able to quite decide who the Tengu were. I suspect very strongly that they were a little like the Robin Hood's forces in Sherwood Forest. I suspect that the Tengu were an anti-social political group. They were supposed to have had large noses, and this causes some people to think that they might have been the remnants of Europeans who had, for some reason or another, gotten into Japan and couldn't get out. This was a little supported also by the fact that the Dai Tengu was represented with red hair. This was not possible to a Japanese, so perhaps it had something to do with foreign background. But in any way, the legend gradually spread that in the forests and mountains and hidden places of Japan, there were mysterious beings who were ever ready to help the oppressed, to whom those in trouble could turn for assistance, for relief, even for food. That all you had to do really was to proclaim yourself the son of liberty and go out in the forest, and the Tengu is bound to find you. Now, this suggests something, and it doesn't necessarily suggest anything metaphysical. It suggests more definitely and practically that there was a gradual building up of an order of people, an order of men, dedicated to the overthrow of the Tokugawa shogunate. Now, if this is doubted, let us remember what happened in Mexico at the time of Miguel Hidalgo. Mexico at that time, of course, was not permitted to have secret societies. But in the place of what we would call secret societies today, the Mexicans developed what were called reading circles. These reading circles were composed presumably of poets who sat down together and read their poetry, a most innocuous pursuit. Although probably in good Spanish it was very charming. But it is quite difficult to imagine some of the fiery characters which were associated with the Mexican labors of liberation as being particularly addicted to verse or to versification. But we do know that the so-called reading societies were the only way in which freedom-loving persons could find an excuse for assembly without danger of persecution. It became more or less like the alchemist. If anyone was foolish enough to spend his evening with poetry or making gold, you might as well let him do it. So in this way, the difficulties were avoided. Now in Japan, at about the time in which the legends of the Tengu were getting good, solid ground, there arose in Tokyo, which was the actual seat of the Tokugawa shogunate, a large group of reading circles. Now these reading circles also consisted of poets. These poets, however, were perhaps a little briefer than the Mexican ones because they seldom did a poem over 3 lines or 17 syllables, which meant they could do a number of poems successfully in one evening. But these reading circles found also that they had further trouble, and that the only way in which they could function at all was to hide themselves away in the least suspected and possible quarter. So they retired into what would be the European equivalent of Montmartre, or the art district and colony of Tokyo, an area without morals or without supervision. And here they very quietly plotted the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. And in their little prints and paintings and pictures and so forth, they hid symbolically the whole story of their intent. They also worked out a very beautiful language of flower arrangement in which they could communicate with each other entirely by floral designs. They devised many different tricks and subterfuges, even weaving some of their important projects into brocade, and after having woven into this brocade some sentiments such as "down with the shogunate," they then proceeded to sell the shogun the brocade, and he very happily and gloriously wore it. This was a true example of the spirit of the time. But out of it all, things happened. And all of a sudden, with a crash, the 2.5-century control of Japan by the military dictatorship fell apart. Practically every force upon which the military depended for protection turned against them. They found that their ranks had been riddled with some kind of treason, and they were never able to find out what it was. But actually, the Japanese people were wiser than the secluded shoguns who liked to sit back somewhere in their palaces and play Go or something of that nature. They were not realists. The merchants at Nagasaki and Osaka were realists. They saw the Western world opening. They saw that it was inevitable that Japan would have to finally become one of the great family of nations. And when the government failed to make the necessary adjustment, these secret societies moved in their political function very much as the Hung Society moved in China. Yet the Japanese political societies also had religious backgrounds. They used the same symbolism, the same legends, the same stories. And many of the legends which we find in the tales of the Genji or in the wonderful stories attributed to the Lady Murasaki, these legends come back in the rituals of these secret societies. And there is no doubt in the world that by double talk they managed to protect themselves against the animosities and persecutions of their time. The final end of the Japanese secret societies was the reestablishment of the empire in the person of the great Emperor Meiji. And it is from the restoration of the monarchy and the end of the Tokugawa shogunate that the advancement of Japan in world affairs is to be measured. There is no doubt that in terms of his own people, the Emperor Meiji was one of the greatest benefactors in the history of Japan. He was largely restored to office by the activity of these societies working under the surface of Japanese life. So we have here a few examples of the points that we wish to make, namely that there is this common pattern of procedure to be found in practically all of the nations of Asia. We find that even in small countries where large movements were not practical, there arose heroes like King Mangut of Siam, who became the spearheads of progress and who used the knowledge which they possessed to the advancement of their people. This brings us to one point which I think is very interesting as we study Oriental religion. I think this point we should all remember. As far as in some instances we like to think or believe in our own way that religion has been opposed to science. has been opposed to progress. I think we should realize that in Asia, this was not consistently the case. Practically all religion was for progress. Religion was for the advancement of man, and not for the repression of man. And from the time of the collapse of the older and corrupted Brahmanic rites which had fallen into disrepute, from that time on, religion in Asia was almost without exception devoted to the advancement of knowledge. Buddhism, Shintoism, Taoism, and Confucianism all respected progress. There was no talk whatever of a religion coming in conflict with science. There was no consideration of a materialism at the expense of religion. In India, there were materialistic sects, and there have been in most other Asiatic countries. But these sects were never particularly meaningful, and no one even bothered to persecute them. For the most part, the entire history of Eastern religion was, perhaps from its ancient Aryan roots, that the more we know, the more we grow, the more we unfold the esoteric and mystical parts of our own natures, the better people we are religiously speaking. That God wants man to know, because it is only the person who knows who can legitimately and honorably cooperate. It is only the person who knows that can glorify God. There is no glorification for God or man in the rulership of an ignorant world. Therefore, as a prince is only honored if his people are enlightened. So a universe only honors God by becoming enlightened, becoming aware of the divine plan and the divine purpose through the advancement of every form of knowledge and insight available to the human being. So everywhere in the East, we find religion either publicly or privately, either through its physical and visible manifestation or through its esoteric and secret teaching. Everywhere we find it encouraging the human being to know, rewarding science, rewarding art, rewarding philosophy, and actually rewarding the non-believer if he was still a person making a valid contribution. So whereas we divide religion in the West very largely from our daily life as far as the common practices are concerned, in the Orient there has never been such a division. Religion moves into life as the garden moves into the house. Religion is just as much a part of our daily experience as any secular subject. There is no division. And because this is true, the people live more or less in a constant atmosphere of religious acceptances. And because of these acceptances, we find they have the capacity for a quiet, disciplined existence, an existence in which beauty, harmony, and truth are constantly available forces and factors. We certainly hope that we have some concern, but we certainly hope that the westernizing of Asia will not destroy too much of this ancient pattern, because someday this pattern must either be world cultivated or we shall all be in difficulty. Some think today that this pattern, which was Asia for the last 5,000 years, is going to move into the West, that the West will become the custodian of Asiatic introversion, and while the East, or Asia, becomes constantly more westernized, that we will find the increasing need for the strengthening of our internal life. Whether it be in the Far East, as in India, China, Japan, or in the Near East, as in Persia, Arabia, Syria, the religious mysteries have always had to do with this enrichment and evolution of man's internal life. What would you say then, we might ask, is the condition of these esoteric orders at this time in Asia? Do they still exist? I think there's absolutely no doubt whatever that the old esoteric orders do exist. I think some of them are corrupt. I think some of them are now perhaps legitimately represented by only a handful of persons who have become deeply inspired and deeply aware of the truth involved. I think some of the older faiths cease and have been partly restored by later students, so that there are breaks in the line of descent. I think the Buddhist mysteries are still practiced, particularly in the less accessible areas. But there is a strong esoteric doctrine in Japan under Shingon, and a very deep philosophical mysticism under Zen. I think what we call psychic manifestation, and to a large part the ancient spiritistic rites of primitive people, including our own American Indians, are still practiced by Shinto. There is no doubt that in Islam, the hierarchy of the Sufis, the Dervishes, the Druzes, and other esoteric groups, that such hierarchy is still functioning strongly and consistently. There is probably a stronger esoteric hierarchy structure under Islam than under any other faith in the world today. In India, the mystical sects, which stemmed from Hinduism, are still strong. Hinduism itself is at this time an uncertain quantity. There seems much to indicate that, like most of the ancient religions of the West, its essential secrets have more or less perished, or perhaps more correctly have been absorbed into their own descendants, that is, into the 10 systems of philosophy that stemmed from Hinduism at a very ancient time. I think there's no doubt at all that the best part of Hinduism did survive in Yoga, Vedanta, Buddhism, and in the sect of the Jains. That China still has secret societies functioning, we know. That secret societies are beginning to take a considerable part in Korean existence, particularly on the boundary areas between North and South Korea, we also know. We know that China is again rehabilitating the Hung society to get rid of its present overlords. There is much evidence in the Indo-Chinese area that Buddhism is making valiant efforts to integrate its own position by trying to bring greater insight to the people of that particular area. Mysticism, asceticism, and subjects of this nature are still valid in Asia. But the average tourist can go for a long time without coming in contact with any of them. The Indian guru system still functions. But more and more it is retiring into a very recondite, contemplative kind of existence. It no longer wishes to advertise itself. And the gurus, who are the links between modern Hindus and the ancient structure of their faith, are less and less inclined to discuss, shall we say, esoteric hierarchy. They are much more inclined to take the attitude that the disciple must develop his own esoteric resources. On the other hand, there is much to suggest that the concept of the Jagat Guru or the Brahmatma still exists in India, that there are recognized to be teachers, adepts, Mahatmas, in distant and remote areas, but the Hindu declines to tell where these are. And he may also, with a somewhat sly expression, remind us that there is nothing more remote from us than our next-door neighbor whom we do not understand. Therefore, that it would not be necessary for any Mahatma to remain in the forests of the Himalayas in order to remain unrecognized. He could be perfectly unrecognized and be our next-door neighbor, because the qualities which he possesses could only be known or recognized by another who was attentive to the ancient signs and landmarks and was able to recognize a degree of spirituality beyond that of an ordinary person. So I have talked to Hindus who know quite a bit about these problems, and they all affirm that the old hierarchies do exist, but that they have retired from common knowledge, and that those desiring to make some form of contact with them cannot do so by taking the next plane to Bombay, but would have to remain up to, at this time, quietly in the disciplines of their orders, under the assumption that when the disciple attains certain insight himself, he will not only be directed where to go and when to go, but as one old Indian teacher who had disciples all over the world told me, he said when the disciple is ready, he doesn't have to go anywhere, for the very simple reason that through inner contact he can be where he needs to be, and he can live in any part of the world and have continual relationships with his guru if he is ready. So it is largely no longer a matter of geography. It is a matter now of man searching for esoteric value. And the whole trend of esotericism in the last several hundred years has been to put the responsibility for growth right back on the individual. That he must grow by his own efforts, by his own integrity, by his own dedication, not because he is prodded along by some doctrine or some teacher, but because in his own heart of hearts, in the soul of his own soul, he knows that this growth is what he must have, and he knows that the advancement of his own spiritual state is what deity demands of him, and that therefore it is his duty and his privilege to grow, thus revealing through his own character the latent mystical powers and attributes which we associate with the initiates of the ancient mysteries. Well, time's up, so I guess we'll have to let you all go home before the bus leaves.